In the year 450 before Christ, a historian stood before a structure in the Egyptian sands that made the Great Pyramid of Giza look like a modest afterthought. He recorded a sprawling, monolithic complex containing exactly 3,000 rooms, half of them plunged deep beneath the earth, guarding the ultimate secrets of a deeply ancient civilization. Fast forward to the year 2008. Ground-penetrating radar sweeps across the barren, sun-baked sands of Hawara and detects an anomaly of absolutely impossible proportions. The underground labyrinth is still there. It never vanished. Yet, the exact moment the data was processed and verified, an absolute veil of silence was aggressively pulled over the entire discovery. Why does a megastructure, vastly larger and infinitely more complex than any known ancient wonder, completely evaporate from our modern textbooks? Is it truly a case of an architectural marvel being lost to the unforgiving desert winds? Or is it a chilling reality where we are simply not allowed to dig? Welcome to Cryptic Realm. Step away from the loud, relentless noise of the waking world and let your mind drift into the quiet, heavy fog of forgotten history. Here, we do not merely recount the past, we wander through the shadows that institutions refuse to illuminate. Tonight, we will journey beneath the Egyptian sand into an underworld of profound silence and forbidden knowledge. Lay back, close your eyes, and prepare your mind to descend into the dark. What happens when the greatest archaeological discovery of the 21st century is deliberately frozen in its tracks? If we are enthusiastically permitted to unearth golden masks and royal tombs for endless museum displays, what is it about a subterranean labyrinth of 3,000 rooms that terrifies the modern academic establishment? The entrance has finally been found, but the gatekeepers have firmly locked the door. What exactly is waiting for us in the dark, silent waters of Hawara? To truly comprehend the magnitude of what has been erased from our collective memory, we must travel back through the corridors of time to the 5th century, before the current era. It is the year 450 before Christ. The world is a vast, uncharted canvas of empires rising and falling, yet Egypt already stands as an ancient, weathered monolith. We must understand that to the people of this era, the Great Pyramids of Giza were already ancient history. They were relics of a forgotten epoch, standing silent in the desert for thousands of years before the first Greek philosophers ever put pen to parchment. Enter Herodotus, a man widely celebrated by modern scholars as the father of history. He was not a man easily impressed. He had walked through the towering gates of Babylon. He had seen the glittering temples of his native Greece, and he had stared up at the sheer, terrifying geometry of the Giza Plateau. Yet, when he journeyed south of the modern city of Cairo, following the winding green ribbon of the Nile River into the heart of the Fayum oasis, he encountered something that shattered his understanding of human capability. The air was thick with the heat of the Egyptian sun, the landscape a sharp contrast between the blinding white desert and the lush, engineered wetlands surrounding the massive artificial basin known as Lake Moeris. And there, resting upon the baked earth of Hawara, was the labyrinth. Herodotus did not describe a myth. He did not recount a legend whispered by superstitious locals around a fire. He wrote a meticulously detailed field report of a structure he explored with his own eyes, walked with his own feet, and touched with his own hands. In his legendary writings, he made a statement that should have echoed through eternity, yet somehow fell upon deaf ears in the modern era. He explicitly stated that if one were to take all the walls, all the temples, and all the great public works of the Greeks, and combine them into a single massive undertaking, they would still fall incredibly short of the labor and the sheer expense poured into the labyrinth of Hawara. He went even further, stating categorically that the labyrinth surpassed even the pyramids. Imagine the weight of that claim. The Great Pyramid of Khufu is a mountain of stone that continues to baffle engineers today. Yet this ancient historian looked at it, then looked at the sprawling complex in the Fayum oasis, and declared the pyramid to be the lesser achievement. How large was this structure? To visualize it, we must strip away the ancient context and frame it in the language of the modern world. Imagine the footprint of the largest international airport terminal you have ever been inside. Now, multiply that sheer horizontal sprawl. We are talking about a monolithic footprint that could comfortably swallow several modern professional athletic stadiums side by side. It was a sprawling, flat city of stone, extending endlessly across the horizon, defying the sky not with height, but with an overwhelming, oppressive breadth. The architecture was fundamentally alien to anything we build today. It was composed of 12 massive covered courtyards, their heavy doors perfectly aligned, 6 facing the north and 6 facing the south, all bound together by a single continuous outer wall. But it was what lay inside this colossal perimeter that bewildered the mind. Herodotus documented a staggering total of 3,000 distinct chambers. Half of these rooms, exactly 1,500, were constructed above the ground level. As he was led through the massive stone archways, the historian found himself swallowed by a dizzying, geometric nightmare of architectural perfection. The transition from courtyard to chamber, from chamber to colonnade, and from colonnade back to another courtyard, was an endless hypnotic loop. The sheer complexity of the winding passages, the sudden turns, the blind corners, and the vast, echoing halls were designed to disorient, to confuse, and to overwhelm the senses. It was a true labyrinth in every sense of the word, a puzzle carved from solid rock. The material itself was a testament to an impossible logistics operation. Herodotus noted with a sense of profound awe that the roof of this entire sprawling complex was made entirely of solid stone, exactly like the walls. Imagine walking through an enclosed stone city where the ceiling above you consists of monolithic blocks weighing dozens of tons, suspended in the dark, stretching on for miles. The walls were not bare. They were covered from floor to ceiling with deeply carved, intricate hieroglyphs, a silent library of symbols that danced in the flickering light of the torches. Every courtyard was surrounded by pillars of perfectly fitted white stone, crafted with a precision that left no room for the blade of a knife between the joints. The acoustic environment alone must have been terrifying. The sound of massive stone doors turning on their ancient pivot hinges was described by Herodotus as the roaring of thunder trapped beneath the earth. With every step he took, the echoes of his footsteps would have bounced infinitely down endless corridors of polished limestone, making it impossible to tell if he was alone or if thousands were walking beside him. He wandered through the 1,500 above-ground rooms, marveling at the incomprehensible wealth and effort required to manifest such a structure. He was witnessing the absolute pinnacle of ancient engineering, a place where geometry, art, and raw human ambition converged into a physical reality that challenged the limits of logic. But as he wandered through this upper realm of light and shadow, he became acutely aware of a boundary. He noticed the heavy, sealed stone ramps and the dark, descending staircases that plunged downward into the pitch-black earth. He was standing on merely the top half of the structure. Beneath his feet, perfectly mirroring the sprawling complex above, lay another 1,500 rooms. A subterranean mirror world. An underworld constructed in complete darkness. When Herodotus asked his Egyptian guides to lead him down those stairs, to show him what was hidden in the lower depths, the atmosphere immediately shifted. The welcoming guides became rigid gatekeepers. He was firmly, absolutely, and unequivocally denied entry. They told him that the lower levels were strictly forbidden to any mortal eyes, save for those of the highest initiates. The above-ground maze, with all its thunderous doors and confusing corridors, was nothing but a grand, elaborate roof. It was a decoy, a massive architectural shield designed to protect whatever lay buried in the dark. What could possibly warrant a security system consisting of 1,500 decoy rooms made of solid stone? As you listen to this, imagine the sheer scale of the secret they were keeping. It leaves us to wonder, what is the true purpose of a maze? Is it to challenge the mind, or is it to completely hide the center from those who are not worthy of finding it? To stand at the edge of a descending staircase, swallowed by the profound shadows of the earth, and be told that you are strictly forbidden to take another step, is a psychological threshold that haunts the human imagination. Picture the ancient Greek historian, a man who had journeyed across the known world, standing upon the polished stone floors of the upper labyrinth. He could feel the cool, heavy air drifting upward from the abyssal darkness below. He was told by his Egyptian guides that the subterranean level contained the burial vaults of the original kings who commissioned this impossible structure, alongside the sacred tombs of revered crocodiles. But does this explanation truly satisfy the logical mind? Does a civilization carve 1,500 subterranean chambers out of solid bedrock, engineer a massive, bewildering labyrinth above it as a security perimeter, and construct roof blocks weighing dozens of tons merely to house the remains of reptiles and long-dead monarchs? Or is it far more plausible that this vast, unlit underworld served a much more profound purpose? Consider the nature of ancient Egyptian culture, a society entirely obsessed with the preservation of life, the mastery of the cosmos, and the eternal recording of their own origins. What if those dark, silent rooms were not a graveyard, but a repository? What if the lower half of the Hawara Labyrinth was the ultimate library of antiquity? A colossal vault designed to safeguard the true, unredacted history of human civilization against the inevitable cycles of cataclysm and decay? Imagine chambers filled not with gold or jewels, which are easily stolen by grave robbers, but with papyrus scrolls, etched granite tablets, and astronomical charts detailing a timeline of humanity that stretches far beyond our currently accepted academic boundaries. The gatekeepers of the labyrinth were not protecting gold. They were protecting an entirely different paradigm of human existence. They knew that true power does not reside in wealth, but in the absolute control of knowledge. To plunge into those lower depths was to look into the naked face of an origin story that perhaps the ancient priesthood deemed too dangerous, too complex, or too sacred for the uninitiated masses. This was a physical manifestation of a classified archive, locked away beneath an ocean of stone. And we must remember that the historian from Greece was not the only credible witness to peer into this architectural abyss. If we were to dismiss his accounts as mere exaggeration, we would then have to confront the meticulously documented testimonies of those who followed in his footsteps centuries later. 400 years after that initial visit, during the dawn of the Roman era, the respected geographer Strabo made his own pilgrimage to the Fayum oasis. He, too, walked across the blinding sands and stood before the labyrinth. His writings entirely corroborate the impossible scale of the complex. Strabo was particularly mesmerized by the ceiling. He documented that the roof of the labyrinth was constructed of stone slabs of such a massive, monolithic scale that they defied all known principles of engineering. He described walking down long, echoing colonnades, where the supporting pillars and the roof above were crafted from single pieces of white stone so vast that no modern crane could easily maneuver them today. He confirmed the bewildering layout, the confusing intersections, and the sheer impossibility of navigating the structure without a highly trained local guide. He noted that a foreigner stepping into that maze alone would be eternally lost within minutes, trapped in a repeating nightmare of identical stone corridors. Do we simply discard the observations of Strabo, a man whose geographical records are otherwise universally trusted by modern academia, simply because his description of this megastructure makes us uncomfortable? And if we dare to doubt Strabo, we must then face the Roman author and military commander Pliny the Elder, who wrote about the labyrinth in the 1st century of the current era. Pliny approached the structure with the cold, calculating eye of a Roman official. He documented the absolute darkness of the inner corridors, stating that the passages were so deep and so enclosed that they were entirely devoid of natural light, requiring blazing torches to navigate even in the middle of the day. He specifically detailed the terrifying acoustic engineering of the massive stone doors, confirming that when they were opened or closed, they emitted a sound identical to rolling thunder, designed to intimidate and disorient anyone who dared to enter. Pliny wrote that the labyrinth was already ancient in his time, yet it stood in perfect, unbroken condition, a silent titan defying the relentless erosion of time. 3 separate men of profound intellect, separated by centuries, all traveling to the same remote location, all reporting the exact same impossible architectural reality. These were not men prone to fairy tales. They were the premier journalists and scientists of their respective eras, documenting a world they could physically touch. Why is it that when these historians write about the politics of Rome or the battles of Greece, our modern textbooks accept their words as absolute, undeniable fact? Yet, the very moment they meticulously describe a vast subterranean megastructure in Egypt, modern scholars suddenly accuse them of mass hallucination, exaggeration, or poetic license. Why does the modern academic establishment selectively filter the historical record, choosing to believe only the fragments of the past that neatly fit into the pre-approved timeline of human development? Is it because the very existence of a 3,000-room, monolithic puzzle box challenges the linear narrative of primitive people slowly figuring out how to stack stones? The labyrinth stands as a terrifying anomaly. It points to a level of mathematical precision, logistical mastery, and architectural ambition that completely eclipses the civilizations that supposedly came after it. It suggests a history of humanity that is not a slow, upward climb, but a story of dramatic peaks and catastrophic valleys. As we look back at the words of these ancient witnesses, we are forced to ask a deeply unsettling question. If this sprawling complex of stone and shadow, this ultimate vault of ancient secrets, was a physical reality experienced by thousands of people over centuries, how does something larger than the pyramids simply disappear from the face of the earth? How does a mountain of carved stone evaporate into the desert air? The answer is as brutal as it is tragic. It did not disappear by magic. It was dismantled by the very forces of empire and time that it was built to withstand. What happens to a library of stone when the society that guards it forgets its own name? To understand how a structure larger than multiple modern athletic stadiums simply vanishes from the face of the earth, we must look away from the grand mysteries of ancient builders and face the brutal, unforgiving pragmatism of human empire. There is a deeply unsettling truth about the architectural wonders of the ancient world. They are rarely swallowed by sudden, dramatic cataclysms or swept away by the wrath of angry gods. Instead, they are usually consumed by the slow, grinding machinery of subsequent civilizations, dismantled block by block by people who have entirely forgotten the sacred meaning of the stones they are holding. As the centuries bled into millennia, the lush, engineered paradise of the Fayum oasis began to change. The climate shifted, the desert winds grew harsher, and the grand, artificial basin of Lake Morris, which once regulated the lifeblood of the region, slowly began to recede. Nature was relentlessly reclaiming its territory, turning the fertile wetlands back into an ocean of blinding, shifting sand. But the true death of the great labyrinth of Hawara was not an act of nature. It was an act of extreme, calculated bureaucracy. When the Roman Empire finally absorbed Egypt, turning the ancient kingdom into a mere province and the personal breadbasket of the emperor, the cultural dynamic fundamentally shifted. The Romans were brilliant engineers and master builders, but they were also ruthlessly efficient pragmatists. When a Roman governor or a military commander looked out across the sun-baked plains of the Fayum and saw the sprawling, monolithic complex of the labyrinth, they did not see a sacred vault of ancestral knowledge. They did not see a library of stone or a geometric puzzle designed to protect the ultimate secrets of human origins. They simply saw the largest, most convenient, and most accessible free hardware store in the entire ancient world. Why would an occupying force spend immense amounts of time, human labor, and financial resources cutting fresh limestone and hauling heavy granite from distant mountains when a perfectly cut, pre-assembled mountain of premium stone was sitting right in front of them? And so, the systematic, government-sanctioned destruction of the greatest architectural marvel in human history began. It was not a sudden demolition, but an agonizingly slow, bureaucratic erasure that spanned across decades, perhaps even centuries. Imagine the sheer, deafening noise that must have replaced the profound, echoing silence of the labyrinth. The ancient, thundering acoustic doors were ripped from their massive pivot hinges, broken down, and hauled away. The monolithic roof slabs, the very stones that caused the Greek geographer Strabo to marvel at their impossible size, were violently cracked, split with iron wedges, and dragged across the sand by teams of oxen. The deeply carved hieroglyphs, The walls that held the silent, unread story of a forgotten epoch were smashed into smaller, manageable pieces to be used as mundane foundations for Roman military barracks, local administrative buildings, and eventually the floors of early Byzantine settlements. The magnificent upper labyrinth, consisting of those 1,500 bewildering above-ground chambers, was literally unbuilt. It was recycled. A structure designed to stand for eternity was casually repurposed into the ordinary infrastructure of a foreign empire. This is the tragic, silent death of history. We often wonder what happened to the lost knowledge of antiquity, without realizing that we are probably walking on it, driving over it, or living inside structures built from its shattered remains. As the Roman occupation faded and the sands of the Egyptian desert continued their relentless advance, the physical footprint of the labyrinth was completely stripped away. Where there was once a sprawling, enclosed city of white stone, there was now nothing but a vast, flat plain of blinding sand, scattered with billions of tiny limestone chips, the bitter dust of a destroyed masterpiece. To any traveler walking across the Fayum oasis 1,000 years later, it would look exactly as if nothing had ever existed there at all. The surface was completely wiped clean. The erasure was absolute and total. But in their ruthless efficiency, the Romans made one critical, magnificent oversight. They only harvested the stone that was easy to reach. They stripped away the walls, the pillars, and the roofs of the upper level, leaving nothing but the massive foundation blocks. But they never dug down. They never breached the subterranean threshold. The lower half of the labyrinth, the dark, unlit underworld of 1,500 deeply buried chambers, the very place the ancient Egyptian priests fiercely protected from the eyes of Herodotus, remained completely untouched. In a deeply ironic twist of fate, the destruction of the upper labyrinth became the ultimate camouflage for the lower labyrinth. By stripping away the surface monument, the Romans inadvertently hid the true vault from future generations of tomb robbers and treasure hunters. As the centuries passed, the heavy desert sands blew across the flat plain, filling in the gaps, burying the colossal foundation stones under thick layers of earth. Furthermore, the local water table of the Fayum basin began to fluctuate, and a dark, highly saline groundwater slowly seeped into the subterranean chambers, filling the dark corridors with an impenetrable, corrosive liquid seal. The underground megastructure was now perfectly entombed, locked away beneath a thick blanket of sand, mud, and subterranean water. It went to sleep in the dark, waiting in profound silence as the modern world slowly built itself up above. The knowledge was not lost. It was merely placed into a state of deep geological suspension. As you picture this flat, unassuming stretch of desert, consider the terrifying fragility of human memory. How easily a society can forget a marvel that once dwarfed the pyramids. How quickly a library of stone can be reduced to a field of scattered dust. If we could forget something so massively, undeniably physical, what else has slipped through the cracks of our historical narrative? What other vast subterranean truths are lying dormant just a few feet beneath the boots of modern humanity, waiting for someone to finally look down and realize that the ground they are standing on is completely artificial? The stage was now perfectly set for the arrival of modern science. A time when men with shovels and academic titles would descend upon Egypt, absolutely confident that they could read the desert like an open book. But what happens when the greatest archaeologist of his generation walks directly over the roof of the underworld, looks down at the ground, and makes the most devastating miscalculation in the history of his profession? The 19th century dawned upon the Egyptian sands not with the quiet reverence of ancient priests, but with the clatter of shovels and the supreme, unshakable confidence of Victorian academia. This was an era defined by a desperate hunger to catalogue the world, a time when men in heavy wool suits and pith helmets descended upon the deserts of the Middle East, absolutely certain that the earth would surrender all its secrets to their modern scientific methods. The prevailing belief was that history was a puzzle waiting to be cleanly assembled, and that with enough funding and enough local laborers, the grand timeline of human civilization could be mapped out perfectly in the display cases of European museums. It was into this atmosphere of extreme academic hubris that Sir William Matthew Flinders Petrie arrived at the Fayum Oasis in the year 1889. Petrie was not an amateur treasure hunter. He was a titan of the field, a man whose meticulous methods of measurement and recording practically invented the discipline of modern Egyptology. He was widely respected, widely published, and entirely convinced of his own intellectual authority. When he set his sights on the sun-baked plain of Hawara, he came with the explicit goal of locating the legendary labyrinth described by Herodotus. He knew the ancient texts. He knew the location of the pyramid of Amenemhat III, which cast its long shadow over the site, and he knew that the Romans had turned the area into a massive quarry. As his workers began to dig through the blinding, swirling sand, they quickly hit something solid. They dug deeper, clearing away thousands upon thousands of fragmented limestone chips, the bitter, shattered residue of the Roman demolition. Beneath this layer of historical dust, Petrie uncovered something staggering. It was a sprawling, continuous, perfectly flat bed of artificial stone. It was a monolithic slab of carved rock covering an area of several acres, so thick and so deeply entrenched in the earth that it defied immediate comprehension. It was a man-made surface of an impossible scale. Petrie stood upon this vast expanse of stone, looked out at the horizon, and began to process the data through the lens of his own preconceived academic logic. He reasoned that because the historical record stated the Romans had dismantled the labyrinth, and because he was currently standing on a massive, flat layer of stone covered in the debris of that dismantling, he had found the ultimate bottom of the structure. He looked at this colossal slab and concluded, with absolute certainty, that it was the foundation bed. He envisioned that the glorious 1,500 above-ground rooms had once stood proudly upon this very stone floor before being violently torn away block by the occupying empire. It was a logical deduction, a perfectly reasonable assumption for a 19th-century mind trying to make sense of a ruined landscape. He wrote his reports, he finalized his measurements, and he confidently declared to the global scientific community that the labyrinth of Hawara was completely, irrevocably destroyed. He announced that nothing remained but the bare, empty foundation of a forgotten masterpiece. Because it was the great Flinders Petrie who spoke these words, the entire academic establishment simply nodded in agreement. The textbooks were written, the case was officially closed, and the world moved on. But what happens when the most respected expert in the world looks directly at the truth and completely misinterprets what his eyes are showing him? Consider the terrifying nature of academic consensus. Once a respected authority plants a flag in the sand and declares a mystery solved, An invisible wall of dogma is immediately erected around that theory. Future generations of students are taught this conclusion as absolute, unquestionable fact. Funding for any further exploration is immediately cut off, because why would any institution pay to dig up an empty foundation? The scientific method, which relies on constant questioning and the reevaluation of evidence, is suddenly paralyzed by the immense weight of a single man's reputation. For over 100 years, the global community of archaeologists walked right past Hawara, blindly accepting the tragic story that the greatest building in antiquity had been totally erased. But Petrie was wrong. He was catastrophically, fundamentally wrong. The tragic irony of the year 1889 is enough to make the modern mind spin into a state of profound disbelief. When Flinders Petrie stood upon that vast, flat expanse of stone, feeling the burning Egyptian sun on his shoulders, he was not standing on the floor of the destroyed upper labyrinth. He was standing on the roof of the underworld. The massive, impenetrable slab of stone that he so confidently labeled as a foundation was, in reality, the impossibly thick, monolithic ceiling designed to protect the lower 1,500 chambers. The Romans had stripped away the top half of the puzzle box, but they had left the lid perfectly intact. Just a few feet beneath the boots of the great archaeologist, separated only by a layer of solid limestone, a subterranean world of immense proportions was resting in the dark, flooded with saline groundwater, holding its breath. Imagine the sheer, deafening silence of those buried corridors as Petrie ordered his men to pack up their shovels and walk away. He was quite literally standing on top of the greatest archaeological discovery in the history of human civilization, and he simply turned his back on it because it did not fit his linear understanding of how a ruin should look. It is a chilling reminder of how easily our perception of reality can be manipulated by authority and assumption. If the man who wrote the definitive book on Egyptian archaeology could be so profoundly blinded by his own logic, what other massive, undeniable truths are we currently walking over every single day? How many other lost cities, forgotten libraries, and subterranean megastructures are lying just inches beneath our feet, dismissed by modern experts as natural rock formations or empty foundations? The story of Hawara sat in this calcified state of academic death for more than a century. The sand blew across the great stone roof, hiding it once again from the eyes of humanity. The world plunged into industrial revolutions, global wars, and the birth of the digital age, completely oblivious to the sleeping giant in the Fayum oasis. It seemed that the secret of the labyrinth would remain perfectly sealed forever, protected not by ancient curses or magical wards, but by the impenetrable armor of modern academic ignorance. It would take a new century, a new generation of entirely independent thinkers, and a radically different kind of vision to finally shatter the illusion. They would not come with shovels to blindly scrape at the dirt. They would come with the power to see through solid stone. What happens when technology finally catches up to the ancient myths, and we are forced to stare at the ghost that we were promised did not exist? For exactly 119 years, the colossal secret of the Hawara sands remained perfectly undisturbed, shielded by the most impenetrable armor known to humanity: the absolute certainty of academic consensus. The world entered the 20th century. It fractured into global conflicts, it split the atom, and it sent metal machines into the cold vacuum of space. Yet the greatest architectural marvel of the ancient world lay forgotten just a few feet beneath the boots of wandering tourists and local farmers. Because the legendary Flinders Petrie had declared the labyrinth utterly destroyed, no university would fund an expedition to look for it. No ambitious archaeologist would dare to risk their professional reputation by challenging the written gospel of the field. To search for the Hawara Labyrinth was to admit you believed in ghosts, but the nature of human curiosity is that it cannot be legislated into permanent submission. Eventually, the old guard retires. The dusty textbooks lose their absolute authority, and a new generation looks at the same barren landscape with a completely different set of eyes. The year was 2008. A quiet, heavily determined collaboration known as the Mataha Expedition arrived at the Fayum Oasis. The name itself, Mataha, translates to labyrinth in Arabic. This was not a sprawling, highly publicized government operation wrapped in red tape and bureaucratic oversight. It was a joint, independent venture led by a team of researchers from Belgium and Egypt who fundamentally rejected the 19th century narrative. They looked at Petrie's conclusions and recognized the glaring, catastrophic flaw in his logic. They understood that a massive, flat slab of artificial stone covering several acres does not necessarily represent the bottom of a structure. Sometimes a floor is actually a ceiling. But how do you prove a theory that requires challenging the entire foundation of modern Egyptology? You cannot simply march onto a protected historical site with an army of men wielding heavy shovels and pickaxes. The era of physically ripping the earth apart based on a hunch is long gone. Modern archaeology is tightly regulated, and obtaining permits to dig massive trenches into the Egyptian bedrock can take a lifetime of political maneuvering. The Mataha expedition knew this. They did not come to Hawara to dig. They came to see. They brought a technology that fundamentally alters the relationship between humanity and the hidden depths of the earth. To understand what happened next, we must completely discard the traditional image of archaeology. There were no brushes clearing away sand from broken pottery, no trenches being carved into the blinding white dust. Instead, the team utilized a sophisticated technology known as ground-penetrating radar. For those unfamiliar with the mechanics of modern geophysical surveying, the concept might sound entirely like science fiction. How does one look through dozens of feet of solid, compacted limestone without moving a single grain of sand? The answer lies in the invisible spectrum of physics, operating on the exact same principles that allow scientists to peer through miles of solid, prehistoric ice in the deepest, most isolated regions of Antarctica. Just as radar pulses can reveal vast, unfrozen lakes and jagged mountain ranges buried deep beneath the Antarctic ice sheet, they can be utilized to peel back the layers of the burning Egyptian desert. It is a process of geological echolocation. It is not magic. It is the ruthless application of electromagnetism. Picture the mechanism. The researchers pushed a specialized sled, resembling a small, unassuming cart, back and forth across the flat, sun-baked expanse of the Hawara Plain. They walked in painfully slow, meticulously straight lines, turning back and forth to create an incredibly dense, overlapping grid pattern. To a casual observer standing a few hundred yards away, it looked like an exercise in absolute futility, a group of people senselessly mowing an invisible lawn of dry sand. But beneath the surface of the earth, an invisible storm was raging. The device continually fired short, intense pulses of high-frequency radio waves directly downward into the ground. These electromagnetic waves plunge through the loose topsoil, moving at a specific, mathematically predictable speed. As long as the material they are traveling through remains uniform, the waves continue downward into the dark. But the moment those waves encounter a sudden change in material density, the physical rules of the underground environment change. When the invisible pulse hits a buried wall of dense granite, or a pocket of empty air, or a chamber entirely flooded with highly conductive, saline groundwater, the wave shatters. A portion of that electromagnetic energy violently reflects off the hidden boundary and bounces straight back up to the surface. The machine sitting on the sand catches this extremely faint echo. This is where the true brilliance of the technology lies. By precisely measuring the exact microsecond it takes for the echo to return, and by analyzing the amplitude and the changing wavelength of that returning signal, a sophisticated computer can calculate exactly how deep the object is and what it is likely made of. If a wave returns quickly, the object is shallow. If the echo is incredibly strong, the wave has hit something massively dense. If the signal scatters in a specific pattern, it indicates the presence of standing liquid. Millions upon millions of these invisible pulses are fired into the earth every single minute, and millions of echoes are caught, recorded, and translated into a raw digital language. The Mataha team was effectively forcing the ground to speak. They were dragging their sled directly over the colossal stone slab that Petrie had mistakenly labeled a foundation. The radar waves punched through the loose sand, hit the top of the monolithic limestone ceiling, and kept going. The electromagnetic energy bled right through the solid rock, pushing into the absolute, pitch-black depths that had not seen the light of day for over 2 millennia. And then, the echoes began to return. Imagine the extreme psychological tension of that moment. You are standing in a blistering desert, holding a piece of equipment, surrounded by absolute silence. But the screen attached to your machine is screaming with data. The signals bouncing back from beneath the heavy stone slab were not the random, chaotic scatter of natural geological formations. Nature does not build in perfect right angles. Nature does not create hundreds of identical, symmetrical voids spaced at exact mathematical intervals. The echoes coming back from the deep, flooded darkness were organized. They were structured. They were deliberate. The expedition members continued to pull their sled, line after line, grid after grid, mapping an area so vast it defied comprehension. They were not looking at a photograph. They were weaving a tapestry of raw numbers that would take powerful software weeks to fully render into a visual image. But even in its rawest, most unrefined state, the incoming data was undeniable. As the sun set over the Fayum oasis, casting long, dark shadows across the flat sand, the invisible waves continued their silent interrogation of the underworld. The team knew they were walking on top of a ghost that the entire academic world had sworn was dead. They were collecting the digital fingerprints of a lost civilization, capturing the exact dimensions of an architectural nightmare that Herodotus had warned us about 25 centuries ago. The threshold had been crossed. The machine had seen through the stone. Now, the only question that remained was what exactly the computers would reveal when all those millions of tiny echoes were finally stitched together into a single, comprehensive picture of the abyss. What does a 3,000-room puzzle box look like when you strip away the darkness? The physical exhaustion of dragging a radar sled across the blistering Egyptian desert is absolutely nothing compared to the suffocating psychological tension of waiting for the digital results. When the sun finally dipped below the horizon of the Fayum oasis, casting the landscape into a deep, absolute blackness, the true excavation began. It did not happen out on the sand. It happened inside a small, brightly lit room where the raw, chaotic noise of millions of electromagnetic echoes was carefully fed into sophisticated processing computers. The scientists of the Mataha expedition sat before their glowing monitors, holding the digital equivalent of an unmapped ocean. The software had an incredibly complex task. It had to mathematically filter out the superficial layer of loose sand. It had to digitally erase the scattered broken limestone chips left behind by the destructive Roman quarrying operations. Most importantly, it had to penetrate the massive, impenetrable monolithic stone slab that the great Flinders Petrie had confidently declared to be the absolute bottom of the structure. The algorithms went to work, translating the invisible waves into a visual language that the human eye could finally comprehend. Imagine the heavy, suffocating silence in that room as the rendering process began. Line by line, pixel by pixel, the ghost was slowly being dragged out of the dark. The image that began to materialize on the screens was not the chaotic, jagged scatter of a natural subterranean cave system. Nature is fundamentally chaotic. It carves through rock with the random, meandering flow of water and the brutal, unpredictable shifting of tectonic plates. Nature does not draw perfectly straight lines. Nature does not engineer massive, intersecting corners with absolute mathematical precision, but the image rendering on the monitors was a terrifying symphony of perfect geometry. At a depth ranging exactly between 8 to 12 meters beneath the baking surface of the sand, the radar waves had hit something spectacular. The computers revealed the undeniable presence of thick, continuous, vertical walls. These were not fragile partitions. They were colossal, load-bearing megaliths constructed to hold up the unimaginable weight of the solid stone ceiling and the thousands of tons of desert sand pressing down from above. As the grid expanded across the screen, the true, horrifying scale of the underworld finally came into focus. The researchers were looking at a sprawling, highly organized matrix of enclosed spaces. They saw long, perfectly straight corridors that seemed to stretch into eternity, intersecting at flawless right angles. They saw massive, rectangular voids that could only be interpreted as colossal underground halls. The layout perfectly, chillingly mirrored the ancient, dismissed descriptions of the Greek historians. It was a labyrinth. It was an infinitely complex, meticulously planned puzzle box buried entirely out of sight. The data explicitly confirmed that the massive stone slab they had been walking on all week was exactly what they suspected it to be. It was not a foundation. It was a roof. Petrie's catastrophic error was now laid bare in stark, high-definition digital proof. The majestic upper level of the labyrinth, the 1,500 rooms that Herodotus had walked through, had indeed been violently ripped away and recycled by the Roman Empire. But the Romans had never breached the floor. The bottom half, the forbidden, completely unlit subterranean realm of another 1,500 rooms, had survived the purge. It was right there, staring back at them through the glowing pixels of a computer screen. But the radar revealed another crucial, deeply unsettling detail about the environment of this buried megastructure. The electromagnetic signals bouncing back from inside the massive stone rooms were highly distorted in a very specific, recognizable pattern. The labyrinth was not filled with dry, empty air. The voids were not packed with loose, shifting sand. The entire subterranean complex was completely submerged. Over the course of 2 millennia, the fluctuating water table of the Fayum Basin had slowly risen, weeping through the microscopic cracks in the limestone and the ancient mortar. The dark, completely sealed chambers had been entirely flooded by a thick, highly saline groundwater. The ultimate library of the ancient world had transformed into an abyssal, underwater nightmare. Imagine what it must actually look like down there in the physical realm. Picture a sprawling, infinitely complex city of smooth white stone, swallowed completely by cold, black, salty water. There is absolutely no light, no sound, and no movement. The thunderous stone doors that once echoed through the halls are now completely frozen in the dark, silent liquid. Whatever artifacts, whatever granite statues, whatever profound records of human origin are hidden within those chambers, they are currently sleeping at the bottom of a buried, corrosive sea. The realization of what the Mataha team had just achieved is almost too immense to properly articulate. In a single, sweeping technological stroke, they had shattered a century of academic dogma. They had mathematically proven the existence of a structure so vast and so deeply ancient that it fundamentally threatens to rewrite the entire accepted timeline of human architectural capability. They had found the mythical beast, and they had measured its teeth. They were holding the absolute, undeniable proof that the textbooks were dead wrong. The thrill of such a discovery is intoxicating. It is the very pinnacle of scientific achievement. You have peered through the veil of time and seen a truth that the rest of humanity has completely forgotten. Naturally, the immediate instinct is to share it. You want to stand on the highest mountain and shout it to the world. You want to publish the raw data, print the 3-dimensional renderings in every major scientific journal, and immediately begin drafting the logistical plans to pump out the saline water and open the ancient doors. The expedition team began to prepare their findings. They meticulously compiled the radar scans, double-checked every single mathematical calculation, and scheduled a massive, highly anticipated public presentation at the prestigious University of Ghent. This was supposed to be the moment the world woke up. This was supposed to be the dawn of a completely new era of historical understanding. But the researchers were about to learn a very dark, incredibly harsh lesson about the reality of modern archaeology. They were about to discover that finding the truth is only half the battle. The true danger lies in trying to tell anyone about it. When you uncover a secret that is larger than the pyramids, a secret that threatens the established authority of the people who control the narrative of history, you do not get a parade. You get silenced. What happens when the machinery of a modern government looks at the greatest discovery in human history and decides, in a single chilling moment, that the world is simply not allowed to know? Imagine the electric atmosphere inside the cold, brightly lit laboratories of Europe as the Mataha team processed their final data. They were sitting on the archaeological equivalent of a paradigm-shifting earthquake. They had the raw numbers, the exact depth measurements, and the stunning 3-dimensional digital renderings. They could quite literally see the massive, intersecting corridors that Herodotus had walked 25 centuries ago, now perfectly preserved and entirely submerged in a dark, silent underwater abyss. The team meticulously prepared to present this world-shattering revelation to the global scientific community. A highly anticipated exhibition and academic lecture were scheduled at the prestigious University of Ghent. The scientific papers were drafted, ready to be aggressively peer-reviewed and distributed to the international press. They expected the world to stop, to listen, and to fundamentally re-evaluate everything we thought we knew about human history. They anticipated a massive flood of global funding, specifically designed to engineer new, sophisticated underwater robotic drones that could swim through those ancient, flooded corridors and read the walls. But archaeology, especially in the ancient cradle of civilization, is rarely a pure, unfiltered science. It is a highly guarded, heavily politicized monopoly. You must deeply understand how the global system of historical narrative actually operates. You do not simply find the greatest secret in the world and freely broadcast it on the evening news. The desert belongs to a sovereign nation, and the history buried beneath that sand is ruthlessly controlled by a very specific, incredibly powerful bureaucratic entity, the Supreme Council of Antiquities. For decades, this governmental council has operated as the absolute, unquestionable gatekeeper of the human past. They alone hold the power to decide who gets a permit to dig, who gets to publish, and what version of history is deemed acceptable. They control the timeline. If an archaeologist unearths a beautiful, glittering golden mask or a mummified royal child that perfectly fits into the established, comfortable narrative of the new kingdom, they are instantly heralded as a hero. Bright television lights are hauled down into the dusty shafts, and highly produced documentaries are immediately broadcast to millions. But what happens when an independent team brings back a radar scan of a sprawling 3,000-room subterranean megastructure that completely shatters the linear evolutionary timeline of human architectural development? You instantly become a threat to the system. The Mataha team submitted their definitive findings to the council, fully expecting a collaborative, historic embrace. Instead, they crashed into a bureaucratic wall of absolute, freezing ice. Just days before the team was preparing to unveil their breathtaking radar scans to the public, a direct, unequivocal, and legally binding order came down from the highest echelons of the Egyptian antiquities establishment. The mandate was not a polite request for further academic review. It was not an invitation to debate the anomalies in the data. It was a strict, aggressive gag order demanding total public silence. The researchers were explicitly, legally forbidden from publishing their final, conclusive radar data. They were banned from sharing the high-definition, three-dimensional renderings of the underground chambers with any media outlet or independent researcher. The highly anticipated presentation at the University of Ghent was heavily pressured, and the core, explosive revelations were surgically removed from the agenda before they could ever reach the ears of the public. The official results of the expedition, the very digital proof that the labyrinth of Hawara still existed and was vastly larger than the pyramids, were instantly classified. The official reasoning given to the stunned researchers and the confused global public was wrapped in the standard, impenetrable language of government bureaucracy. The council formally claimed that the ban was enacted in the name of national security and the absolute necessity of protecting the ancient monument from potential harm. Let us pause in the dark and deeply analyze the terrifying, insulting absurdity of that official statement. We must apply basic, unyielding logic to this narrative. The Mataha expedition did not bring heavy bulldozers to the Fayum oasis. They did not bring dynamite, and they did not even bring a single metal shovel. They simply walked across the flat surface of the sand with a machine that emits invisible, harmless radio waves. They did not touch a single ancient stone. They did not expose the subterranean chambers to the harsh, destructive oxygen of the modern atmosphere. The labyrinth is perfectly entombed beneath a massive, impenetrable monolithic rock ceiling and entirely flooded with heavy, dark groundwater. How exactly does publishing a digital radar scan on a computer screen in a Belgian university physically threaten a submerged, sealed structure deep beneath the Egyptian desert? How does knowing the mathematical dimensions of a buried stone wall endanger the national security of a modern state? If a medical doctor takes an X-ray of your chest, does the photograph break your ribs? The excuse completely disintegrates the moment you apply even the absolute minimum amount of critical thought. The sudden suppression was never about protecting the stones. The stones have fiercely protected themselves for over 2,000 years. The suppression was entirely about protecting the narrative. The academic gatekeepers of history recognized exactly what those radar scans represented. They saw a structure of such immense, incomprehensible scale, acoustic engineering, and mathematical perfection that it could not possibly be attributed to the primitive, slow evolution of society that they have built their entire lucrative academic empires upon. To publicly admit that the Hawara Labyrinth exists, and to concede that it is vastly larger and infinitely more complex than the Great Pyramid of Giza, is to admit that the modern institutions know absolutely nothing about our true origins. It is to confess that a highly advanced, fiercely capable civilization existed long before we are currently allowed to believe, and that they possessed engineering capabilities that we still cannot replicate today. The academic establishment is absolutely terrified of a blank slate. They are terrified of having to rewrite every textbook, of having to admit to generations of trusting students that the great Flinders Petrie was catastrophically wrong, and that the modern institutions have been blindly guarding an empty foundation, while the true, unredacted library of antiquity was sleeping right beneath their boots. The aggressive silence imposed upon the Mataha team was a desperate, heavy-handed attempt to maintain the illusion of intellectual control. Let us contrast this immediate suppression with how the modern archaeological machine typically operates. When a team in the Valley of the Kings unearths a previously unknown tomb containing a minor, forgotten nobleman, the response is spectacular. We are enthusiastically permitted, even encouraged, to dig up graveyards. We are actively invited to stare at the dried, fragile remains of ancient monarchs through the thick, climate-controlled glass of museum displays. The system heavily celebrates the excavation of the dead. But the labyrinth of Hawara is fundamentally different. It is not a graveyard. Herodotus explicitly documented that it was a massive administrative, spiritual, and archival center. The lower 1,500 rooms were the ultimate restricted vault. When you transition from finding shiny golden trinkets to finding the structural equivalent of an ancient global library, the reaction of the establishment completely inverts. They do not bring the television cameras. They bring the legal threats. What is the fundamental difference between a tomb and a library? A tomb merely tells you how a single person died and what shiny objects they owned. A library tells you how an entire civilization lived, what profound cosmic knowledge they possessed, and most terrifyingly, where they actually came from. If those flooded subterranean chambers hold the original records of the human race, written in a time before the great historical forgetting, then those records hold the power to completely dismantle the authority of every modern historian on Earth. The gatekeepers are not protecting the labyrinth from us. They are protecting themselves from the labyrinth. The political maneuvering required to enforce this ban was absolute. The Council possesses the ultimate veto power over any and all information extracted from their soil. If a foreign team refuses to comply with their directives, their excavation permits are instantly revoked. Their multi-million-dollar equipment can be seized, and the lead researchers are permanently blacklisted from ever conducting scientific work in the country again. For a career archaeologist, this is the exact equivalent of a professional execution. You are exiled from the greatest historical sandbox on the planet. The Mataha expedition was violently cornered. They had mapped the ghost, but they were held hostage by the wardens of history. They had to make an agonizing choice between releasing the full, explosive truth and risking the destruction of their entire careers, or bowing to the immense political pressure, redacting their own life's work, and maintaining their fragile ability to simply look at the sand. It is a deeply heartbreaking, invisible compromise that happens in the quiet, sterile offices of academia every single day. The truth is systematically negotiated, diluted, and carefully filtered until it is deemed entirely safe for public consumption. And so, the highly anticipated presentation at Ghent went forward, but it was a hollow, heavily censored shell of what it was supposed to be. The jaw-dropping, high-definition models of the flooded corridors were hidden away. The definitive proof of the structural integrity of the lower level was heavily obscured beneath vague terminology and non-committal scientific jargon. The researchers were forced to stand before their peers and present a heavily redacted ghost story, knowing full well that the unedited, earth-shattering truth was sitting locked inside their encrypted hard drives. The global media, which thrives entirely on easily digestible sound bites and flashy gold discoveries, completely missed the nuance of the suppression. The story briefly flickered in a few obscure, highly technical scientific journals, and then instantly died, buried beneath the relentless, deafening noise of the modern 21st century news cycle. The global public, endlessly distracted by the mundane anxieties of the present, never even realized that they had just been violently robbed of their own ancient history. But the most horrifying aspect of this bureaucratic cover-up is the undeniable paradox of their official excuse. If the government truly cared about protecting this unparalleled monument, as they so vehemently claimed, their actions would reflect the exact opposite of a gag order. The radar data explicitly proved that the entire subterranean complex is currently drowning in a highly corrosive, heavily salinized groundwater environment. Every single day that the labyrinth remains flooded, the harsh salt is actively eating away at the ancient mortar. The dark water is relentlessly dissolving the deeply carved hieroglyphs that line the walls of those 1,500 chambers. The greatest library of antiquity is actively rotting in the dark. If preservation was the actual goal, an immediate, massive international coalition would have been formed. Brilliant engineers would be drafting urgent, highly sophisticated plans to carefully pump the destructive groundwater out of the Fayum Basin, stabilizing the subterranean environment, and deploying modern technology to map the flooded corridors before the massive stone roof finally collapses under its own weight. You do not protect a drowning man by making it illegal to take a picture of the water. By actively preventing the publication of the data and fiercely refusing to initiate a rescue excavation, the authorities are not protecting the labyrinth. They are condemning it to a slow, silent, underwater death. They are allowing the greatest architectural and historical treasure on the planet to be slowly digested by the earth, simply because acknowledging its existence is too politically and academically inconvenient. This profound paradox reveals the darkest, most unsettling truth about the modern guardians of history. They would much rather let the truth literally disintegrate into salty mud than allow it to challenge their fragile, carefully constructed authority. The veil of silence was successfully pulled back over Hawara. The great Flinders Petrie's devastating mistake remains the official, unchallenged doctrine of the textbooks. The labyrinth is still officially considered to be a completely destroyed myth, a pile of scattered Roman gravel. But the invisible electromagnetic waves do not lie. The pure mathematics of ground-penetrating radar cannot be bullied or silenced by a government council. The massive subterranean megaliths are still there, holding up the roof of the underworld, defying the quiet desert night. As you trace the lines of this deliberate cover-up in your mind, a cold, heavy realization begins to settle in. If the establishment is willing to go to such extreme lengths to suppress the non-invasive radar scans of a structure that we already knew existed from ancient historical texts, what else are they hiding? If they are this terrified of a building that is perfectly entombed in dark, salty water, what happens when someone accidentally stumbles upon a subterranean vault that is still dry? The machinery of suppression is not a shadowy conspiracy. It is a highly visible, incredibly efficient administrative process. It operates right out in the open, cleverly disguised as preservation and academic rigor. But true science does not fear new data, and true preservation does not require blinding the public. The absolute moment an institution demands complete silence, they are instantly confessing that they are absolutely terrified of what you might hear. To fully grasp the profound tragedy of the Hawara suppression, we must stare directly into the dark, churning heart of the preservation paradox. The official, legally binding justification for shutting down the Mataha expedition and burying their digital radar scans was the absolute necessity of protecting the ancient monument. We are told that leaving the site completely undisturbed is the only way to ensure its survival for future generations. But let us apply the cold, unyielding light of logic to this bureaucratic defense. The ground-penetrating radar did not simply map the massive, monolithic walls of the subterranean underworld. It also provided an exact, terrifying diagnosis of the environment inside those 1,500 buried chambers. The entire subterranean complex is completely submerged. It is entirely flooded by the local water table of the Fayum Basin, which has drastically changed over the last 2 millennia due to modern agricultural practices and the construction of massive dams along the Nile River. This is not clean, pure, stagnant water. It is a highly corrosive heavily salinized liquid. It is a dark, chemical soup that is actively, aggressively eating away at the structure every single second of every single day. Picture the devastating reality of what is happening right beneath the sand as you listen to these words. The heavy, salt-laden groundwater is relentlessly gnawing at the ancient mortar that has held those colossal limestone blocks together for thousands of years. The corrosive liquid is slowly digesting the profoundly intricate hieroglyphs carved deeply into the walls of the sprawling corridors. If the ancient Egyptian priests truly used this lower labyrinth as the ultimate vault, a supreme stone library designed to archive the true, unredacted history of their civilization and the cosmic knowledge they possessed, then that deeply sacred information is currently dissolving into a thick, salty mud. Every passing month that the global academic community turns a blind eye to Hawara, an entire chapter of human history is physically erased, flaking off into the black water. To claim that you are protecting a monument by allowing it to drown in acid is not merely a failure of logic, it is an insult to human intelligence. If a museum director discovered a pipe leaking highly corrosive acid directly onto the Mona Lisa, they would not aggressively ban the security guards from taking photographs of the puddle. They would instantly shut off the water, mobilize a massive team of restoration experts, and do absolutely everything in their power to save the masterpiece. Yet, when faced with a structural masterpiece that mathematically dwarfs the Great Pyramid of Giza, a building that could fundamentally answer the greatest questions about our ancient origins, the authorities choose to lock the door and let the water rise. Why? The answer is deeply terrifying because it exposes the incredibly fragile psychological foundation of modern historical institutions. The gatekeepers are not afraid of the water. They are terrified of the walls. They are terrified of what those walls will mathematically prove. For over a century, the global academic establishment has poured billions of dollars into constructing, maintaining, and defending a very specific, strictly linear narrative of human evolution. We are meticulously taught that human civilization is a slow, upward climb. We are told that we began as primitive hunter-gatherers, slowly figured out how to domesticate wheat, eventually learned to stack mud bricks, and then, through thousands of years of painfully slow trial and error, finally achieved the glorious pinnacle of the modern technological age. It is a highly comforting narrative. It places us, the modern humans holding the smartphones and splitting the atom, at the absolute apex of the evolutionary mountain. It makes us feel supremely intelligent, advanced, and secure. But the Labyrinth of Hawara is a colossal 3,000-room architectural dagger pointed directly at the heart of that comforting illusion. You do not slowly evolve into building a subterranean puzzle box of monolithic stone spanning dozens of acres. You do not casually design a mathematically perfect, mirrored megastructure with acoustic blast doors and impenetrable rock ceilings through simple trial and error. A structure of that magnitude requires a profound, highly sophisticated mastery of geometry, logistics, geophysics, and hydrology. It implies a civilization operating at a level of unified purpose and technological capability that we simply cannot comprehend, let alone replicate today. To drain the water from Hawara, to open those ancient, thundering stone doors, and to allow independent scientists to physically walk through the lower 1,500 chambers is to invite the absolute destruction of the linear timeline. It would force the most decorated historians and archaeologists in the world to stand before the public and admit that everything they have taught for the last century is fundamentally wrong. It would force them to confess that human history is not a gentle upward slope, but a violent, terrifying series of dramatic peaks and catastrophic valleys. It would prove that an advanced, highly capable civilization existed deep in antiquity, achieved a level of greatness that completely eclipses our own, and then somehow suffered a collapse so absolute that their greatest achievements were reduced to myths and scattered gravel. The institutions of the modern world are completely incapable of processing that level of intellectual humiliation. They cannot afford the paradigm shift. If the labyrinth is acknowledged as a reality, every single textbook currently sitting in every single classroom on Earth becomes instantly obsolete. The lucrative grants that fund traditional, safe excavations would suddenly dry up. The highly prestigious academic chairs and tenured professorships built upon the old linear model would be entirely delegitimized. History is not merely a collection of old stories. It is an incredibly powerful, deeply entrenched industry. And like any massive industry, it will fiercely, aggressively protect its core product from any disruptive new technology or conflicting data. The suppression of the Mataha expedition was the frantic immune response of an academic system trying to protect itself from a terminal infection of the truth. But let us push deeper into the shadows of this cover-up. Let us wander into the truly forbidden territory of the mind. What if the resistance to opening the labyrinth goes far beyond mere academic pride and the protection of tenure? What if the highest echelons of the Antiquities Councils, or perhaps shadowy organizations operating far above them, actually know exactly what is buried in the flooded dark? Consider the overwhelming security measures of the ancient builders. They did not just build a library, they built a fortress of absolute deception. They constructed a sprawling, terrifying maze of 1,500 above-ground rooms, specifically designed to confuse, disorient, and exhaust anyone who tried to find the entrance to the lower vault. You do not engineer a security perimeter of that impossible magnitude unless the information you are protecting is unimaginably dangerous. What kind of knowledge requires a 3,000-room puzzle box to keep it safe? Perhaps it is not simply the history of a forgotten golden age. Perhaps the deeply submerged walls of Hawara contain the exact, highly detailed records of the cataclysm that ended that golden age. A civilization capable of building the labyrinth would certainly possess the astronomical and geological understanding to know exactly why their world was ending. If history is truly cyclical, as the ancient texts constantly suggest, then the labyrinth might not be a mere museum. It might be a warning. It might contain the precise mathematical cycles of global destruction, the exact astronomical alignments that trigger planetary resets, or the deeply guarded technologies that allow a select few to survive the inevitable flood. If you are a modern gatekeeper, standing at the top of the current power structure, holding the reins of global society, that is not a warning you want the general public to read. It is far easier and far more politically stable to pretend the warning does not exist. It is safer to let the heavy, corrosive salt water silently digest the message than to risk the absolute social and philosophical chaos that would erupt if humanity suddenly realized how truly fragile their existence actually is. The paradox of preservation is a deeply calculated theater. They tell us they are protecting the stones, while they secretly allow the ancient memory to be washed away into the dark, subterranean ocean. They have weaponized time and water to do the dirty work of censorship. As you picture those massive, perfectly cut limestone walls slowly crumbling in the dark, you must ask yourself a terrifying question. Are we simply the victims of a bureaucratic cover-up, or are we actively participating in our own historical amnesia? By silently accepting the official narrative, by refusing to demand the unredacted radar data, we are allowing the modern gatekeepers to steal our inheritance. The greatest architectural marvel ever constructed by human hands is crying out from beneath the sand, sending its invisible electromagnetic echoes into the modern world, begging to be remembered before the salt completely consumes it. Yet, the institutions turn off the monitors, lock the doors, and tell us to go back to sleep. But a ghost of that magnitude cannot be permanently exorcised by a gag order. The labyrinth is waiting. It has outlasted the pharaohs, it has outlasted the Romans, and it will undoubtedly outlast the fragile, frightened academic institutions of the modern age. The only question that remains is whether we will finally summon the collective courage to look beneath the surface before the last ancient echo fades completely into the dark water. Let us leave the sterile, brightly lit offices of the modern academic authorities and the frantic, politically suppressed laboratories of Europe. Let us step away from the noise of the 21st century, with its endless digital distractions and its comforting, manufactured illusions of absolute historical certainty. Let us return, one final time tonight, to the cold, absolute silence of the Egyptian desert. Picture the vast, flat expanse of the Fayum oasis, resting under the heavy, silver light of a cloudless, moonlit sky. The burning heat of the day has completely evaporated, replaced by a freezing, deeply settling chill that seems to emanate directly from the ancient bedrock itself. The wind whispers softly across the shifting dunes, blowing billions of tiny, shattered limestone chips across the exact spot where the great Flinders Petrie once stood and catastrophically misjudged the floor of the world. From the surface, it looks like nothing but an empty, desolate wasteland, a blank canvas of sand stretching out toward the dark horizon. But you know the truth now. You know exactly what is sleeping just 12 meters beneath the cold earth. As you lie in the quiet safety of your own room, listening to the steady, rhythmic draw of your own breathing, project your mind downward into the Egyptian soil. Push past the loose topsoil. Push through the heavy, monolithic limestone roof that the Romans left behind, and plunge completely into the black, silent, deeply flooded underworld. Imagine the profound stillness of those 1,500 subterranean chambers. There is no light down here. There has been no light for over 2 millennia. There is only the immense, crushing weight of the earth and the slow, corrosive embrace of the dark, saline groundwater. The massive stone walls, meticulously carved with the lost mathematical and cosmic records of a forgotten epoch, are standing like silent, drowned giants in the abyss. They are holding their breath, waiting in the dark, while the modern world above blindly continues its chaotic, arrogant march towards the future. When the Mataha expedition sent their invisible electromagnetic waves down into this darkness in the year 2008, they effectively turned the key in a lock that had not been touched since the dawn of the Roman Empire. They found the entrance, they mapped the threshold, but the heavy bureaucratic doors of the modern establishment instantly slammed shut, violently denying us passage. Perhaps, in our supreme arrogance, we view this suppression merely as a tragic failure of science or a cynical political conspiracy. But what if we look at it through a much darker, far more philosophical lens? What if the aggressive silence imposed upon the Hawara Labyrinth is not entirely an act of malicious theft, but a terrifying mechanism of self-preservation? Consider the absolute state of the modern human condition. We are a deeply fractured, highly volatile species that routinely weaponizes our own technological advancements. We struggle to peacefully manage the fragile reality we currently inhabit. If we were suddenly handed the unredacted, deeply profound cosmic truths of an ancient, highly advanced civilization, truths that mathematically prove our timeline is a lie, and that devastating cyclical resets are the true nature of the planet, would we actually be able to comprehend it without tearing our own fragile societies apart? Perhaps the gatekeepers are unconsciously serving a purpose. Perhaps the tragic reality is that the entrance has finally been found. The coordinates have been digitally verified. But we are simply, fundamentally, not ready to walk through the door. Just as the frozen radar anomalies buried beneath the deep ice of Antarctica represent a threshold we are not currently permitted to cross, the flooded labyrinth of Hawara stands as a colossal, submerged monument to our own intellectual and spiritual immaturity. The ancient builders designed a 3,000-room puzzle box because they knew that ultimate knowledge must be earned, not merely excavated by men wielding shovels or dragged into the light by computer algorithms. The truth remains perfectly entombed, waiting for a version of humanity that is actually worthy of receiving it. And so, the megastructure remains completely untouched, slowly dissolving into the salty mud, a ghost trapped beneath the sand. As the heavy fog of sleep begins to pull you away from the waking world, let the profound, echoing silence of the labyrinth wash over your consciousness. Think about the massive, thunderous stone doors that have not moved an inch in thousands of years. Think about the vast, unread library of human origins swimming in the pitch-black water just beneath the boots of the modern world. If an architectural marvel vastly larger than the pyramids can be successfully erased from our collective memory and actively suppressed by the very people sworn to protect it, what other massive, undeniable realities are currently being hidden from your eyes? If the ground beneath our feet is completely artificial, how solid is the reality you wake up to every single morning? Do not fear the shadows of history, for it is only in the absolute dark that the deepest truths are kept safe. Let your mind drift down the endless, flooded corridors. Let the rhythm of the dark water pull you deeper into the abyss. What is waiting for us at the very center of the maze? Will we ever be brave enough to find out? Or will we simply sleep through the greatest revelation in human history? Drift away now into the quiet, heavy mysteries of the cryptic realm. The truth is down there, breathing in the dark. Sleep well, and let the questions echo into the night.